Welcome to Looking Back, Looking Forward, where we sit down with experts for an in-depth discussion of an historical event that shaped Canada in important ways. These conversations are integral to our mandate at the History of Social Change, which is to explore our unique history through the lens of social change with the belief that we must look back in order to look forward, that we cannot understand who we are today without knowing and learning from our past. Today, we're exploring the 50th anniversary of the Ugandan Asian Resettlement in Canada. Very briefly, because we're going to get into, we're going to ask our guests to share their story much more profoundly and in more detail. In August 1972, Ugandan President Idi Amin demanded the exodus of all Ugandans of Asian descent. Within 90 days, 50,000 Ugandans were forced to leave and seek asylum elsewhere. In response, Canada opened its borders to approximately 8,000 Ugandan Asian refugees from 1972 and 1974, representing, from what I understand, and you guys can confirm this for me, Canada's first major resettlement of non-European refugees. To commemorate the 50th anniversary and explore the event and its impact, we have with us two prominent guests. Shezan Muhammedi is a policy analyst, and I think I said your last name wrong, so you'll have to correct me, an adjunct research professor in the Department of History at Carleton University. He's also the author of Gifts from Amin, Ugandan Asian Refugees in Canada. Using archival research and oral histories, the book explores the historical context of the resettlement, Canada's refugee policy, and how thousands rebuilt their lives in Canada. Jalal Jaffer is a Canadian-based lawyer and author of Memories of Ugandan Refugee, Encounters of Hope from Kampala to Vancouver. The memoir recounts his personal story of growing up in Uganda, his dangerous escape with his wife in 1972, and his gratitude to the country that embraced him ever since. So, with that introduction, I am going to get right into the questions, if I still have both of you there with me. Are you still there? Hello?
We're still here. Yeah,
okay, absolutely. Good. So like I said, I gave a very, very short blurb of historical context and that I really want to leave that to you to sort of explore further due to your own personal experience and research and all that. But if we can just look back at the experience of Asian Ugandans before the expulsion. What was life like there? It's always an interesting question for people. Like, did this happen out of the blue? Was it a shock? Was it not so much? If anyone of you want to get into that a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, Jalal, let me know what you're thinking.
Just to give you a broad context, and I'm talking about the 1960s. When we think about Asians, it was not a monolithic group. It was quite literally segmented into Hindus, Muslims, Ismailis, Goans, and others. There was no unified leadership. Asians typically were very apolitical. They had no interest in getting into the political world. They were primarily motivated to ensure security, both in terms of economic security and clearly physical security. They were almost in their little silos, right, and they did their own thing and they wanted to be left alone. Now, this was a time when the colonialism was coming to an end, and African nationalism and basic nativism was really unfolding. Some very important individuals, like if you think of West Africa, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Obote in Uganda. These were really strong leaders who came to the forefront, and their prime ambition was to govern themselves, let the indigenous Africans govern, and reap the benefit of independence. So there was a strong undercurrent where Africanization, this is the word often used, was really thriving. Political philosophies and political ideologies was leaning leftwards. Socialism was the new sort of supposedly benefit for every new emerging African independent country. So there was pressure beginning to mount because Asians were seen in a country like Uganda as holding back indigenous Africans. So the undercurrent was there. And gradually pressures were mounting. And I'm specifically just talking about Uganda. Obote brought about what he called the Common Men's Charter, which was a socialistic leaning document. He did a May Day declaration in 1970, where he nationalized, at least he declared various companies, important companies, to be nationalized. So the pressure on Asians was growing. And then obviously the government said you have to declare yourselves whether you're citizens or not, and you have to take citizenship if you want to live and work in this country. And for the most part, and I think I speak particularly from the Ismaili perspective, which I'm perhaps more familiar, overwhelming majority had no difficulty in taking citizenship because that was the only country they knew. There was no connection anywhere else. India was a far, far entity that they had no relationship with. So the idea of Ugandan Asians having obtained citizenship considered Uganda as their permanent home. And that's how the sort of landscape was. And there was, again, speaking from the Ismaili perspective, very strong emphasis on education, very strong emphasis on self-help. Our institutions were very strong in terms of looking after the needs and aspirations of the community. And this is when suddenly out of the blue comes this declaration. Idi Amin threw away Obote in a coup. Asians actually applauded that because they thought that Idi Amin would reverse these socialistic ideas and they would again have that comfort in the economic area. But lo and behold, within a matter of less than a year, the famous dream came into being. And when he made the declaration, nobody took him seriously. Everybody thought this was just yet another buffoonery on the part of the president, Idi Amin. And they thought that Britain or anybody else will calm him down and make him see the sense, how senseless his objectives were and his decision was. But I think over a short period of time, panic, absolute fear, uncertainty gripped the Asians, and the rest is, if you know, is history. They tried to get out as quickly as possible, fearful that nothing mattered to them other than their lives. So the idea of giving up their assets, their memories, their emotional attachment to the country vanished overnight. It was almost like, I need to protect me and my family and get the hell out of this country because nobody else is going to help me here. So that was really to the context in which the Asian expulsion took place.
Okay, thank you. Shezan, what did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Jalal touched on some really interesting points. And one of the things is that if we look at it from a historical context, while South Asians, a lot of migration started happening in the 1850s, it happened much earlier. So it traces all the way back to like the 9th century and even the 2nd century, even that far back where we're seeing trade in the Indian Ocean world. And so there was this establishment of an early like mercantile class, right? So a lot of like merchants and trade and commerce was running through South Asians that were living all throughout like the Arabian Peninsula and further into East Africa, mainly off of Zanzibar, but then, with the construction of the railways and things like that in the 1800s, early 1900s, we start to see this really, really go into the mainland. So start getting into Kenya, Tanzania, and eventually Uganda. And so the thing that becomes quite interesting is those that came in that colonial period, so started coming around, late 1850s, early 1900s, they all really do talk about Uganda in a bit of a romanticized way. When I was interviewing folks to say, it was a paradise, right? Like they often joke about how they never talked about the weather. This was a new thing when they came to Canada because it was consistent, equatorial, lush, warm weather. You can wear your flip-flops. It was sundresses or shorts and a t-shirt. Like, didn't really think twice too much about it. And so
Right.
That was one of the things that came out a lot as a major theme, is people always talked about it as this paradise where some folks say they had a much better quality of life in Uganda versus quantity of life here in Canada. And they make these comparisons, which is really, really fascinating to see the difference. And they talk about, different senses of community belonging and community values there in Uganda versus in Canada. So they do a lot of this like comparison, which is quite fascinating. And of course, there were definitely some instances of folks being involved in the political landscape, trying to fight for independence, because it was a really tough position to be, considered a British subject and, having these ancestral ties to the Indian subcontinent, which was under British rule at the same time, right until 47, to not be arguing for independence for Uganda, but also be arguing for it, at home. And so there were instances where it was very, very difficult, because the challenge that South Asians were put in, because they were seen as this like intermediary between the Black Ugandans and the white colonialists, they were kind of in a rock and a hard place, right? That proverbial sense where if they kept their British passport, they were seen as colonial collaborators from the Ugandan Africans. Just, of course, this is where you're going to choose to go. And then if they chose to become Ugandan nationalists, then the opinion of Ugandan Africans was, oh, you're just benefiting off the hard work of emancipation, of what we did, so that you can now benefit as a Ugandan citizen, because now you own the business, now you are a local, now you can take advantage of what's there. And so this became a really difficult place for the Ugandan Asian community, because kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so that made things quite interesting. And for the large part, there were, in the interviews, I interviewed almost about 70 people, and there were maybe one or two that kind of saw a little bit of the writing on the wall. Everyone understood the tensions that existed in the community. I think that was quite obvious and quite honest. Folks were like, there was a stratification in society, and we were, benefiting from it in certain ways. But to Jalal's point, like, they largely, once the decree came out, they were like, this won't stand. You cannot revoke people's citizenships. You cannot force these people, especially in just 90 days. This isn't going to come to fruition. And, they had already started to see the populism and the rise of Idi Amin. And so they were buying into this sense that like, oh, this is just another, foolish or ambitious endeavor from Idi Amin. This will not stand. There were a couple of folks that actually migrated in probably the late 1970, early 71, after Idi Amin came to power, just because they sought these tensions. They thought, based on what we're seeing, maybe it might be best to head out. But it was a very, very small number. And it wasn't until, as Jalal was explaining, things became a little bit more serious in September, when these, Idi Amin was issuing these edicts every, 1 to 2 weeks, saying, actually, not all of you have to go. All of you who are professionals, teachers, etc., you can stay. And then, if you're a doctor, if you work for the public service, if you're a Ugandan citizen, maybe you can stay. And then 3 weeks later says, actually, scrap all of that. Everyone's got to go, which really led to quite a bit of panic.
Yeah. Thank you. So now let's talk about your personal story in terms of what brought, well, I know that Shezan, you're going to speak more maybe to your family or to the folks that you interviewed, however you want to address this question. But Jalal, perhaps you can talk about what specifically brought you to Canada, of all places, and why Canada as opposed to some other of the choices that you had. And just as an additional kind of bonus question here, I was curious whether you ever planned on returning to Uganda. Was it something that you thought was going to be permanent, or did you always kind of get the sense that Canada was your new home?
As a general proposition for Ugandans generally, slightly different than my own personal story, which is unique, quite frankly. The general idea of why Canada, I think Canada was not on the radar screen of anybody. Canada was thought of, if anybody ever thought about it is people still living in igloos or completely frozen area in vastness of snow and ice and so on. So it was never considered within the realm of possibilities. But I think two or three things that happened which quickly changed that. Firstly, the arrival of the Canadian immigration team into Uganda. Now, their operation and their approach was in such sharp contrast to how the British were looking at it. Britain had a legal and moral obligation to take care of the Asians, and yet they were far from laying out a welcoming mat. In fact, there was such strong resistance. They were doing it so haphazardly. And I think the Asians saw that contrast. Canadian team was compassionate. They were very friendly. They were warm. They were welcoming. So that was a significant contrast that Asians noticed. And Canada became attractive from that point of view. I think from the, again, the Smiley context, they were guided by His Highness the Aga Khan. And he very much suggested that you should go to Canada if you can. So that made it so easy for most of the Smileys to make that decision without any hesitation. And I think that perhaps led to Canada as a prime destination. But only about 5,000 at the time came to Canada. I think some of them followed later on. But the bulk of the Asians ended up in the UK. And if I look at my own personal story, which is very different, we all know about Mike Malloy from the immigration department. And he happened to visit Uganda the year before the expulsion. And he was, I think, perhaps asked to just keep an eye on what's happening in Uganda, if there's any assistance that Ugandan Asians might need. So when he came to Uganda a year before, it was just coincidental that myself and some others of my friends acquainted with him. And we spent an entire week of socializing with him. We would meet at each other's place for dinner, and Mike was our favorite guest. And it became such personal relationship. And he was not promoting anything. He was just saying that if you guys are interested in coming to Canada, I would be very, very receptive to helping you and assist you. So that's the kind of conversation. So it opened our minds to the idea of Canada. When the expulsion order came, I had no intention on Canada was not on my mind at the time because I could go back to England. I had the British nationality. I'd studied in England. My wife had studied with both going to university in England. So we knew England quite well. It was something that we were exposed to, a Western way of life and so on. So there was no hesitation initially. Mike came and we connected. And Mike says, so what are you trying to do? Do you want to come to Canada or are you going to go to England? So I said, Mike, geez, I haven't thought about Canada. So he says, look, here's what we might do. Him and I had played squash in the meantime. So we were on the squash court. He says, I'll consider that squash game as my interview with you. And I will process your application and we can do your health requirements right away. Take that visa. You don't have to go to Canada, but in case you want to, you have an option. That's how it started. So I went, quite frankly, I went to England thinking that I would be living in England for the rest of my life. But within a matter of a few weeks, it felt so claustrophobic being in London. I spent a lot of time in the Canadian Embassy looking at newspapers. I really read up the Toronto Star and the Globe and the Mail and really got a sense of Canada quite quickly. And it was then no contest. My wife and I agreed that we will migrate to Canada. So we came a month or two later, but we ended up in Toronto.
Right. And then you went to Vancouver afterwards, right?
Yeah, that was about 8-9 months later.
Right. Okay. And just as an aside, Mike Malloy, if anyone who is listening eventually to this conversation, we have a digital story with Mike Malloy that we produce. So if they can check that out. Thank you for that, Jalal. That was an interesting story, a unique story. Shezan, what would you like to add to that story?
Yeah, and so a lot of folks actually ended up in Canada as those who were rendered stateless. And so the concept that what Canada's immigration team was there to do at the outset was to take, initially, the orders were take those who qualified under the system. So if they are going to qualify as economic migrants, go ahead and do so. Evaluate them on the point system, and of course, use discretion where you can. So as you're conducting an interview, if you feel that someone's in genuine need and meets the requirements, while they might be below the required 50 points, you can add 10, 15 points to the application and bring them through to Canada. And then orders came about 2 to 3 weeks later to say, actually, we need to prioritize those who do not have anywhere else to go. So if they do have a British passport, or they do have an Indian passport or Pakistani passport, let them go to those high commissions, let them apply there. Let's try and take those that genuinely have nowhere to go. And so that became the impetus, is take those who are stateless. And this is principally why a large number of Goans and Ismaili Muslims come to Canada, is because the Goans were largely public servants. And so many of them had to become Ugandan citizens in order to keep their careers after independence in 1962. And many Ismailis had become skilled professionals or entrepreneurs. And so with this rise of socialism, and then, of course, Idi Amin coming to power, there was these edicts put in place to say, actually, in order to keep your business, at least 50% must be owned by an African national. And so there were some, of course, some ways to get around this through bribery and things like that, or naming someone else to be the owner operator of the company. Whereas in the background, it's actually still a South Asian, like someone of South Asian descent, a Ugandan Asian. But of course, many people took out these opportunities. And so this is why you end up actually having such a large number of highly skilled, highly trained, very highly educated folks coming to Canada, and particularly because they were either entrepreneurs or public servants, or they were part of different religious communities that had opted to get Ugandan citizenship for various reasons. And so that became the main reason why folks ended up in Canada. And for my family in particular, that was the big one, is they were all Ugandan passport holders. And so our family had only really owned like sort of a small corner store, but had taken Ugandan citizenship. And that was also some of the advice that was given at the time from the leader of the Ismaili community. So the Aga Khan had said, in the 60s, when independence was occurring throughout regions of Africa, saying, become citizens in the lands in which you live. And so that was some of the guidance they received. Of course, there are some folks, part of this community, part of other communities, that held on to British citizenship as well as their Indian citizenship as well. And so that's where they went. So that's the really interesting piece, is that the UK or India did not take anyone that was not a passport holder. So they took 0 folks who were stateless. Only Canada was the largest recipient of stateless. Folks ended up in places like Europe, in everywhere from Austria to Sweden to Germany to Belgium, in this movement, much smaller numbers, but those would definitely be folks that were stateless as well.
Okay. And so it seems also that, I don't know if anyone wants to answer this part of the question, but that there was didn't really seem like there was a desire or somehow a long-term goal of one day returning to Uganda. It seemed like, because I know sometimes, people come to Canada to escape certain times of conflict. I mean, we could look at Ukrainians right now even, and a lot of them are talking about, well, can't wait to go back to Ukraine, can't wait to return. I'm not picking up on that kind of narrative here. Am I wrong?
There was actually a mix. Yeah. So
Okay.
It was really tough. So a lot of folks did want to return, especially those that were older.
Okay.
So those that were probably coming to Canada in their 40s or 50s, possibly even their 60s, really didn't want to leave. And there were some relatives that were left behind, particularly if they were quite elderly, so in their like 80s plus or 90s, just because transportation and managing all of this and getting out of the country in 90 days was quite difficult. And a lot of folks were hesitant because they saw what was happening under Idi Amin's regime. And so while there was still a lot of love for Uganda, they knew that the country was going to descend into turmoil and chaos, and it largely did, and kind of set back the country for several years until 1985, once we have the return to Obote, and then we have Muhammedi coming to power, and kind of that restoration. So it's not until I think it's the early 90s that an apology is issued, or maybe it was the late 80s, where an apology is issued, and the Ugandan government says, folks, if you do want to come back, you're more than welcome to do so. And we can figure out things like access to properties and business ventures and things like that. So there is this push to return. But at that point, folks had been out of the country for almost 10, maybe even 15 years, and largely established themselves in places like Canada or the US or the UK. And so there has been some return migration, not as large as one would anticipate. And there's also been renewed migration. So like starting in the probably I'd say like early 2000s, a new group of South Asians, and as well as large amounts of Chinese immigration as well to Uganda in particular.
Okay, interesting. Curious about the tools, the support networks, and the challenges, everything sort of in terms of setting up a new life. And there's always the pros and the cons and the difficulties. But I know this could be like a 2-hour answer, so I'm going to limit it a bit to specifically looking at what Canada did right and wrong in that support network, in those tools they provided, because we're going to sort of take that Canadian angle of what they might have learned from this experience, or what they could have done differently, what worked. Anyone want to get to that? Jalal, do you want to start again with that?
Again, I think a general proposition would be different from my own personal experience.
True, yeah.
My personal experience was purely by coincidence. When I arrived in Toronto, my wife and I, just recently married, both energetic and excited. And we go to the Manpower office. The first night we were given accommodation in Ford Hotel on Dundas Street. I still remember that crummy little hotel. And yet it was a solace of sorts, comfort. Next day we go to the Manpower office, and out of the blue, we started chatting with Don Allen, who was the face of Canada for us. And he says, Jalal, would you be interested in perhaps spending a couple of weeks with a local Canadian couple who have offered to billet you, as opposed to staying in a hotel until you find housing and work and so on? So I had no hesitation. I said, I'd love to. So out come Vera and Michael Ryan, young couple living in Toronto. He was part of Oxfam. And we spent 2 weeks with them. And it was perhaps life-changing for us. Because within that 2 weeks, I attended the NDP national conference as an exposure. Michael would take me. Within that 2 weeks, he had a dinner party with which amongst some interesting individuals came the Dean of the Faculty of Law from McMaster, who happens to be subsequently the Justice Yakubuchi on the Supreme Court of Canada. At the dinner meeting, I happened to be talking to Professor Yakubuchi at the time, and he asked me what I was doing and what was my aspiration. And I said, look, as a young child, I was thinking of law, but of course I saw law was not something I could do in Uganda. It just would not appeal to me. So he says, don't give up on that idea now that you're in Canada. If there's anything I can do for you, phone me, right? You should get into law if that's your passion from your childhood days. Now, it never came to being that I had to phone him or seek advice. And at that time, it was not possible. I had a job already within the first 2 weeks. Both Shamsad, my wife, and I got jobs, and we were ready to start a new life. But it was at the back of my mind that I could go into law. And once we moved to Vancouver, it was a sudden decision to say, maybe I'll apply to the law school. And I went through law school. And it was interesting, about 10, 20 years later, our paths again crossed in Vancouver. At that time, Justice Jacobucci was being celebrated by the Italian Community Center as somebody who has excelled in public life. And the Ismaili Council representative, I was asked to go. I didn't know who the guest speaker was, and off the cuff, that's who I see being celebrated. So I recounted that story about how he influenced my thought pattern, and he just that spur that he gave me, and I ended up in the legal profession and have been practicing law ever since. And he said he absolutely remembered that, and it was such a wonderful evening. But coming back to the general proposition about talking about what Canada did and how it could do different. One of the things from my own experiences as St. Michael and Vera, if something like this were to happen on a more regular basis, I think it gives such enormous strength and comfort to a newly arrived immigrant. And we perhaps don't do enough of that. And related to that is the idea of setting up social occasions for immigrants on a regular basis. And that is so critical because from, again, our own experience as Ismailis, we tend to go to our prayer sessions. We call it the Jamaat Khana on a regular basis. And every Ismaili loves to go there because there's a social element to it, also apart from your prayers. And this is how we would constantly interact with each other. We would share our stories. We would learn from each other. We would take tips from each other. This is what I did. How do you buy a car? Where do you go? What do you do? And it can be enormously therapeutic, but also helpful in early days of settlement. And I think that played a remarkable role. I certainly speak for, again, from the Ismaili context, that it really meant a lot for the new arrivals, that it gave them comfort, it gave them confidence, it gave them support, and to know that you were not alone, there were others like you. And we could laugh about it, we could think about it as some funny things happening all the time. And it was a wonderful way to start your life in a new country.
That's a great point. Shezan, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I'll build exactly where Jalal sort of left off. And that was the two really big things that came out from the research that I had done is faith and religion played huge roles as a tool to help with senses of belonging, navigating the challenges of life in Canada, and creating that social hub again. And that really tied in quite well to what was known as these welcoming centers and welcoming committees. They were called like Uganda Asian committees. And there were 12 set up across the country with representation from all three levels of government, voluntary organizations, NGOs, and the general public. And I think that was the key. When we leveraged getting the public involved, it made for these unique one-on-one interactions. It made for that opportunity for folks to say, oh, this is your field of expertise. Actually, I'm in that same business. Right. Let's help you get on that pathway. Or yes, Canadians are quite odd about these things. Like, this is a fun one. And like, yes, we talk about the weather incessantly because it changes all the time. And so these were things that were quite helpful. And I think replicating that success, there were even ads put out by, there was the head of the Edmonton Uganda committee just wrote out saying, hey, folks, like, come in for a chai and a chit chat. You know, just come to meet people, come to do these informal conversations. And people would drop into these centers to offer donations, their time, and even resources to say, you know, actually, I'm looking to hire. I want to help some folks that have just come to this country. How can I do so? And so leveraging the public was huge and very, very successful. And I think we've seen this over time. You know, we've seen this in our private sponsorship program with those that have come from Indochina. So like Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotians in the late 70s, early 80s. We saw the Canadian community come together again with the Syrians, with the Afghans, and now Ukrainians. And so it's this beautiful story of Canadians lending helping hands, because once we kind of remove all those layers and it's that one-to-one human connection, that's where we really start to build these relationships. That being said, I think the greatest challenges that folks encountered were probably like four main challenges. The first would be employment discrimination. So a lot of folks, and it continues today, is they're asked for, the infamous Canadian experience or Canadian credentials. So this would be things like, oh, your university degree from so-and-so is not recognized here. You're going to have to get recertified. It's not on par. Go back to school. Or, you've got all the right things, but you've never worked in Canada. So, this is just a way, a thinly veiled form of discrimination in that sense. And so that was tough because a lot of folks were underemployed, particularly at the beginning. And you wouldn't understand this based on the government reporting. The reporting is going to say things like, well, the stat that they use is within a year, almost 90% of heads of households who had applied were employed, but it doesn't tell you what type of employment, right? And so that's where it was quite challenging. The second was racism in general. So there was quite a bit of discrimination that was happening. And a lot of it was on the micro level, right? So like daily interactions, aggressions, and things like that, particularly between like the late 70s and probably like mid 80s, where there was this rise of packy baiting, where folks would just, see a brown body and label it as, a packy, a dirty packy, and you need to go home and things like that. The third would probably be these shifts between a more secular and individualist society in the Western world compared to life in East Africa, where you did have this community sense. And so it came with benefits and also consequences. And so some folks, when they're reflecting on this in their interviews, they'd say things like, we did miss the idea that back home where, our kids were playing with someone else, you wouldn't worry about whether they're going to be fed or they're going to be safe or things like that. This was very much the village community idea. They'd be well looked after. I don't have to think twice about this. And then on the flip side, they talk about things like, well, when I went back to visit in the late 2000s, or when I went back, my uncle made a comment about what I was wearing. And I was kind of like, well, I can wear whatever I want. You don't need to tell me what I can and cannot wear. And, this isn't I don't live in this patriarchal space anymore. Like, these are very, very different. Or we don't need to worry about what's the community going to say about what I wore to this event. So that was really, really interesting to see that nuance come out. And then last, of course, was the climate. The climate was definitely a challenge for folks. Like, winter was not a pleasant experience. Many
Probably
joke
still
about
isn't.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Many still struggle. I know my mom still struggles. But the weather was quite tough, especially for those that came in the first few months, because they were coming, October, November, which is unbelievably cold for someone coming from the equator. And this was just the beginning. I remember my mom being like, this is the end of October and I'm frozen. And all of her colleagues at work being like, oh no, it's about to get much, much worse.
This is nothing, right? Yes, good. Those 4 challenges are actually, they really sort of run the gamut of everything that I sort of wanted to address. So that's great.
I think only one thing I'll just quickly
Yeah.
expand on, because I think it is important.
Yeah. Is it for this question?
Yeah, for the one we just did.
Just did. Okay, go for it.
And to Jalal's point was really good about this, about the community connections in the religious communities, because those were huge. And this is for like the Goan community, the Hindu communities, like this was across all the diversity that was within this group. And, reconnecting with your local temple and things like that, especially if there was an established community, was great. And for the Goans, it was really, really interesting because they're followers of the Christian faith. And so they had access quite quickly to religious institutions that already existed in Canada. And so it became this really unique opportunity for them to integrate and very, very fast. And then you also have, other communities that for the first time, they might have the right numbers to set up a prayer hall instead of, meeting together at someone's home. And so often they were engaging other religious institutions. So I know Ottawa, for example, one of their first prayer halls that they put together for a Muslim community was in a church basement. And that they got for free. So the church was like, oh, of course, like houses of prayer are houses of prayers. Right. So if you want to use this, please feel free to do so. And so I think even that, right, that spirit also being welcoming was something that was really special for this community.
Thank you for adding that. I want the next question I wanted to get to was how that experience, the experience of resettlement, and for you, Jalal, specifically going through expulsion and resettlement, and Shezan, your family, how that affected your personal professional choices. Now, Jalal, you sort of mentioned the law, and So maybe that's, I'll let you answer it, but I'm saying that I'm sure that has an impact, but I'll let you sort of, I won't speak for you. Go ahead.
I think generally coming to Canada, there was an immediate recognition that one could do virtually anything one wants to within the parameters of what your particular constraints might be. Now, when I think about my own life, we both had good education from good universities, and yet our first objective was to get a job, to be self-sustaining. So we pick any job that came across, and I'd been involved in the financial institution in Uganda as a manager of a trust company at a fairly young age, and I thought that's where my vocation might be. So it was not unnatural to seek employment in the banking industry. So I started with Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce at the time, but I wasn't happy there, and it was not something that was gave me the strokes in terms of indefinite. I couldn't be a lifer in a banking institution.
Right.
And law was at the back of my mind, but I couldn't go to law school because I still had to work to put food on the table, and my wife worked and so on. But here is what Canada perhaps gave me that opportunity. I became a real estate agent, as did my wife. So I was, in a sense, full-time realtor, but I managed to get to law school, and I went to law school. So I did what I needed to do in law school, just barely, to get through my classes, because the demand in terms of academic requirement was not that high, especially having been educated in England, which perhaps is tougher. So here I was able to manage that I could be a realtor and I could still be going to law school. I cut my classes humongously, but I managed to comfortably get through my law school. But I think Canada allowed that opportunity. And likewise, many others, as a general proposition, understood that you can do night courses in any number of subjects if you apply yourself, that you could do what you need to do to sustain yourself. And yet, if you are enterprising, you are determined, the environment allows you to progress and to get to where you want to go. So in a sense, I think it was contrast to what Uganda might have been. The opportunities here were so much greater, and it opens your mind that the sky is the limit in a sense. There are obviously limitations, but if you push yourself, if you strive hard, you can get to where you might want to. And I think that was a sharp contrast to how we were brought up from Africa to coming into a country like Canada.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you. Shezan, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think for my own trajectory, it was significantly influenced by my mom. So my mom's inspiration lies behind my PhD thesis and the book. I was so curious, growing up about what this life was like for her in Uganda, and what was it like, she was 17 when she came to this country with her two younger brothers and my grandma. What was it like for others? Like, she can't be the only one that has gone through this experience. And I was really curious. And when I started to do the research, I realized there was nothing in our Canadian historical narrative. There's nothing that existed. And I'm like so honored. And it's like such a, humble point of departure for us to have this academic book there for the public, there for the community. It's now there in the historical record officially, as an academic book, and in time for the 50th anniversary. Just, divine timing, of course. Like, this was unbelievably incredible. And so I'm really thankful to all the people that kind of opened up their homes and their hearts to me to share these stories, which were particularly, traumatic at times. Like, my mom really did not open up about her experience until I was like halfway through my PhD. So it was something that was really meaningful, and it's guided my life's purpose since then. And so after after completing my PhD, I worked for an international NGO doing refugee resettlement in Europe. So I was working with Syrians, Afghans, and Tajiks, one-on-one family support. So securing asylum, getting into national language courses, reskilling, employment opportunities, and then kind of navigating the realities of integration and resettlement, especially in places like Bad Salzuflen in Germany, where the population was small itself, and then you have this whole new wave of 100 Syrians and 50 Afghans that have just come to this small city of 10-20,000 people. And what is that like? And so for me, it's always been this concept of paying forward the generosity that was given to my mom when she first came here to others. And so that's kind of carried on, and now I work for IRCC, so Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, as as a senior policy analyst now, trying to see how we can support newcomers today at a policy level, and see how best we can do it. So I'm currently even in the Afghanistan sector, so helping with the Afghanistan resettlement.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so that really has had that kind of impact on the choices you made in your career. In terms of resettlement and what we learned about refugee immigration policy and practice, do you think we've learned lessons from our past? What do you think about that? Have we taken some lessons from those years and put them towards doing better or doing same if we did a good job in current crises and situations? Jalal, what would you say to that?
So, a couple of thoughts that came through in my mind. And I think the questions, I'm just going to relate them to how you had planted them.
Sure.
The idea of immigrants generally and how we approach that, I think it's a tough one, because quite often there's not enough appreciation for the value or the intellectual abilities of the new immigrants coming through. There's some almost a patronizing attitude that we are giving a helping hand, not realizing that many of these immigrants are really intelligent, very capable, very sophisticated individuals who come. They bring enormous amount of value to the country. And I think, generally speaking, there is, in my respectful view, there's not enough appreciation. The idea of cultural differences, cultural norms, we think of them almost in a patronizing way as very different and alien to ours, and therefore we probably look down upon that. And I think that it's a mental frame, and I'm talking about generalization because individuals are very, very different. And I think it would be a great learning experience to understand the idea that immigrants are individuals just as smart, if not smarter, than we might be, and they bring enormous amount of value for the country. And I say that in relation to how diversity can always be strength, in my view. I think His Highness is a great proponent of that, and the pluralism is an ideology that it is really not only acknowledging and appreciating the differences, but actually celebrating the differences that we bring, and that is so much significant. So in my view, that is something we could learn and perhaps pay a little more attention when we are talking about immigrants and immigration generally. And that understanding can change in a variety of ways in how we actually set up our programs and our approaches to new immigrants. And I was thinking about the role corporations can play, the school system can play, in terms of the corporations can have special internships, special mentorship programs geared for immigrants, new immigrants, and think of that as an investment, not as a handout. And I think that's psychological change can affect our policy making decisions.
Thank you. Well said. Shezan?
Awesome. Yeah, I think some of the interesting lessons learned come from an approach towards flexibility. So a lot of scholars will argue that our immigration system has become quite rigid, and we haven't used the types of flexibility and policy levers that we can to unlock certain things really quickly. And so if we look at Uganda as an example, we physically moved. So we got folks through an entire immigration process and landed 4,175 people in under 60 days on charter flights. And this is before the advent of major digital technologies. This is, before emails, before, even this virtual environment that we're working in right now, before that existed. And that's very impressive. On a paper-based system, they were able to get that many folks here that quickly. And they had issued in that same period of time almost just over 6,000 visas. So they had done this is medical examinations, interviews, everything for over, I think it was 6,100 some odd visas in that time. So very, very quick. And so the lesson learned is really, let's leverage flexibility where we can, allow officers to use discretion. It's been this back and forth between academics and even the immigration system, how much discretion is good and how much is enough, and how can this be informed by things like bias, and how can this be a bad thing, but also how can this be a good thing? And so it's gone back and forth over time, but I think often, and Mike will be a big proponent of this as well, is he's like, these are individuals who are well-trained, who understand the situation, who are conducting the interviews, give them that flexibility back. To have this opportunity to make these decisions and to be guided by these Canadian principles and values. If this is genuinely a humanitarian endeavor, allow them to have the opportunity to facilitate the movement of folks. So that's one big one. And another really interesting one that came out of this movement in particular was the importance of food and the importance of ensuring that it adhered to dietary requirements so that, when folks were landing in the military base, so this is a Canadian Forces base, Long Point, just really close to Montreal. And so they had actually trained the head chef on how to make Indian food. So they had a chef at a local restaurant train him on how to do so. And so folks talked about how when they first arrived, how welcoming it was for them to not only have food that they could eat, so adhered to, whether you're a vegetarian, didn't eat pork, didn't eat beef, but also tasted like home, and so how important that was. And I think this is so significant, when we're looking at, Syrians, Afghans, Ukrainians, if you even look at former Yugoslavia and communities that came out of those movements, how something so small can make such a massive impact and such a huge difference. For folks to feel already part of the Canadian community. So I think that's one of the big lessons that has certainly carried on and definitely continues. I think that was one of my favorite memories in the archives is the Sarnia Uganda Committee releases a newsletter on what you should feed Ugandan Asians and some of their recollections about how they really like plain yogurt and how this is quite bizarre. And they eat rice with everything. And it was really interesting to see this come through.
I love that. I never would have thought of that. Sorry.
Add to that, because I think, of course, in my respectful view, this whole approach to Ugandan Asian refugee, how quickly we processed 60 days that Shezan just talked about. I think a lot of those kinds of decisions depend on the leadership at the highest levels. And if you bear with me, I want to read a little short excerpt of a little article that I wrote for Huffington Post. This was when the Syrian crisis was at its height. And we all remember that Alan Kurdi, the little boy who was washed across along a beach, and it really tugged at the heart of everybody who was a thinking person. And I happened to be on the Vancouver radio program talking about how the Syrian refugee crisis was handled in contrast to how the Ugandan refugee crisis was handled. And I spoke my mind that it was not really as compassionate and as welcoming. And Huffington Post happened to hear that program, and I was contacted the next day to say if I would write something of what I had spoken about. And if you bear with me, I will just read that very quickly.
Yes.
And I just say in my book, actually, today as I watch and read about Alan Kurdi's story and can barely contain my emotions and learn that millions of Syrians subjected to fear, panic, trauma, and total helplessness, far worse than Ugandan Asians were ever exposed to, can only be processed to come to Canada at the rate of 2,000 in 5 years. I wonder what happened to the Canada that brought me and some 5,000 out of the clutches of a brutal dictator within a matter of days, without subjecting them to a bureaucratic nightmare and years of waiting. Where is the Canada that processed and brought in some 60,000 Vietnamese boat people in less than 18 months? Where is the compassion and desire to make things happen expeditiously exhibited during the migrations of large numbers of refugees from Hungary and Kosovo? And I go on to say, as I think about this and reflect upon my daily interactions with everyone I come into contact with, I'm convinced that most Canadians have not lost any bit of this compassion and humanity. I believe the failure to take urgent steps and expedite the arrival of Syrian refugees in reasonable numbers and within a reasonable period of time might have a lot to do with the degree of apathy, a lessened sense of compassion and empathy at the highest levels of government departments. And I was obviously talking about the Harper government at the time, which seemed to be a little tougher on immigrants. And I said, humanity and humanitarianism ought never to be a foreign policy objective. There must be intrinsic values that each one of us possesses and wants our Canada to reflect, and without reservation. So that was my reaction to the Syrian migration, as opposed to how Ugandans were so incredibly well treated in 1972.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. That's a very poignant and important point that you made as a distinction there. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
No,
Delighted
our
to
pleasure.
be here. Take care.
Okay.
Here, have a great
bye.
day, everyone. Bye.
Take care, Shezan.
Take care, Jalal.